This article's lead section may not adequately summarize key points of its. Please consider expanding the lead to provide an accessible overview of all important aspects of the article. August 2012. Depressive realism is the proposition that people with depression actually have a more accurate perception of reality, specifically that they are less affected by positive illusions of illusory superiority, the locus of control, and optimism bias. Studies by psychologists Alloy and Abramson and Dobson and Franch suggested that depressed people appear to have a more realistic perception of their importance, reputation, locus of control, and abilities than those who are not depressed. People with depression may be less likely to have inflated self-images and look at the world through rose-colored glasses, thanks to cognitive dissonance elimination and a variety of other defense mechanisms that allow them to ignore or otherwise look beyond the harsh realities of life. This does not necessarily imply that a specific happy person is delusional nor deny that some depressed individuals may be unrealistically negative. Some recent studies argue, contrary to the hypothesis, suggesting that mentally healthy people actually have fewer positive illusions and illusions in general than depressed ones. For example, studies by Mzetfi and others found that when replicating Alloy and Abramson's findings, the overestimation of control in non-depressed people only showed up when the interval was long enough, implying that this is because they take more aspects of a situation into account than their depressed counterparts. And other studies such as Joyner and others found that all forms of illusion, positive or not, were associated with higher depressive symptoms. It might also be that the pessimistic bias of depressives results in depressive realism when, for example, measuring estimation of control when there is none, as proposed by Allen and others. Various other recent studies such as Fu and others, Carsona and others and Boyd Wilson and others reject the idea of depressive realism by showing no link between positive illusions and mental health, well-being or life satisfaction, maintaining that accurate perception of reality is compatible with happiness. A longitudinal study found that self-enhancement biases were associated with poor social skills and psychological maladjustment. In a separate experiment, where videotaped conversations between men and women were rated by independent observers, self-enhancing individuals were more likely to show socially problematic behaviors such as hostility or irritability. A 2007 study found that self-enhancement biases were associated with psychological benefits, such as subjective well-being, but also interpersonal costs, such as antisocial behavior. When studying the link between self-esteem and positive illusions, Compton identified a group of successful persons which possessed high self-esteem without positive illusions, and that these individuals weren't depressed, neurotic, psychotic, maladjusted nor personality disordered, thus concluding that positive illusions aren't necessary for high self-esteem. Compared to the group not so successful with positive illusions and high self-esteem, the disillusional group with high self-esteem was higher on self-criticism and personality integration and lower on psychoticism. A meta-analysis of 78 studies including 7305 subjects by Moore and Fresco found that slightly more studies supported the depressive realism hypothesis, Cohen's D equals -0.07, SD equals 0.46. Both depressed and non-depressed participants were found to be strongly positively biased, which does not go in line with the hypothesis. Studies lacking an objective standard of reality and that utilize self-report measures to assess depression were more likely to find depressive realism effects. There also was a significant moderation to the effect by the method which was used to measure depressive realism. However, it should be noted that this was an exploratory analysis. Judgment of contingency and recall of feedback studies produce very small depressive realism effects owing to biases in opposing directions in both depressed and non-depressed groups, a negative bias in the former and positive bias in the later. Evaluation of performance studies, however, demonstrated small antidepressive realism effects. Arguments. Since there is evidence that positive illusions may be more common in normally mentally healthy individuals than in depressed individuals, Taylor and Brown argue that they are adaptive. However, Passini, Moore and Epstein point out that from the perspective of cognitive experiential self-theory, depressive realism may be because depressed people overcompensate for a tendency toward maladaptive intuitive processing by exercising excessive rational control in trivial situations, and note that the difference with non-depressed people disappears in more consequential circumstances. Ni and Zuckerman have challenged the definition of mental health used by Taylor and Brown, and argue that lack of illusions is associated with a non-defensive personality oriented towards growth and learning and with low ego involvement in outcomes. They present evidence that self-determined individuals are less prone to these illusions. Colvin and Block have criticized the logic and empirical evidence used by Taylor and Brown to link mental health and positive illusions. They argue that there are a fair number of studies that failed to replicate the findings, and that a closer examination of the evidence doesn't support their thesis. Dyckman and others argue that, although depressive people make more accurate judgments about having no control in situations where in fact they have no control, they also believe they have no control when in fact they do, and so their perceptions are not more accurate overall. Dunning and Story, 1991, have shown that when applied to real-world settings, depressed individuals are less accurate in their predictions about the future and more overconfident than their non-depressed counterparts. Examples: the French philosopher Voltaire's classic 1759 novella Candide, or Optimism, deals with this subject, and can be considered an early exploration of this psychological phenomenon. The story is an attack on Leibniz's optimistic theory, that as is the best of all possible worlds, a philosophy that is espoused by the character of Professor Pangloss, even though the events around him are presented as unambiguously awful. Much of the humor in the story comes from Pangloss's rationalizations of these miserable and cataclysmic events, as he will not admit that even the worst forms of individual human suffering are not all for the best. His position is counterpointed later in the book by the character of Martin, a more depressive character whose pessimistic philosophy may not be any better for getting along with life, but his viewpoint is certainly the least deluded as to the reality of the world around him. Candide's own conclusion on the subject can be summed up in his utterance that optimism is the madness of insisting that all is well when we are miserable.